Hey y'all, it's Jennifer. Welcome back to my channel. Today I am coming to you with some spring book recommendations, but the majority of my list, as I was putting this list together, wound up being classics. So essentially this is a list of classics to read in the spring. I feel like I have a good mix here in terms of time periods and in terms of novels versus poetry, but I do think a lot of my recommendations here are going to be Victorian. So let's just go on and get into my list. Something that is not Victorian, but which I feel is kind of a quintessential spring classic, is the Metamorphoses by Ovid. And so this is an epic poem that is essentially retelling the Roman and Greek myths. And there's something about mythology in general that I think really feels springtime to me. And especially like this myth here that's on the cover, which is Daphne and Apollo, and Daphne is turning into the tree. It just feels very appropriately springy, and I think Ovid's language is really beautiful and really cozy in an interesting way. And so this is one that I think I read for the first time in the spring, and I'm going to be reading it again this spring. So I'm going to be buddy reading this with Faith in Books next month in April, and I'm really excited about it. It just feels like the time of year to be reading Ovid. But the Metamorphoses really sticks out to me in terms of having a lot of floral and natural kind of imagery. I just think it's really, really beautiful. But the Fasti could be here, his erotic poems could be here. Basically anything by Ovid I feel is probably a pretty good spring recommendation, but the Metamorphoses is definitely one I would recommend. Someone else that I feel like is probably just a quintessential author that you could recommend to read in the spring would be Thomas Hardy. And I really struggled here narrowing things down because I have so many favorites by him that I feel like are both spring and autumnal feeling works. And so this really was hard for me to narrow down. I just wanted to recommend one. And the one that I chose, I think really just has a lot of beautiful nature imagery. Most Thomas Hardy books do, but this one stands out to me in terms of imagery, but it is not my favorite of his in terms of character work or plot, and that is the Woodlanders. Though this doesn't rank very highly for me with Thomas Hardy, I would say it's not even in my top 5. What I do really remember about this was the respect given to the setting and kind of the way the setting felt as if it was a character in the narrative. This is also true of my favorite Thomas Hardy, which is Return of the Native. And yet I feel like Return of the Native was very much an autumnal story, and really Return of the Native and the Woodlanders are very interesting to compare, and yet I feel like Woodlanders is very fresh, it's very new, and it feels like it's focusing on new possibilities and new changes in the character's life, which also feels very quintessentially spring to me. This definitely has Thomas Hardy's incredibly beautiful writing and of course his incredibly beautiful nature writing, which is largely why I read Thomas Hardy, but this just did not feel as strong for me on a character level or a plot level as many of his other books do. And so this is one I've always felt like I probably did not give a fair shake. This is one I feel like I should probably try to come back to with fresh eyes and reevaluate because I feel like I should really love it, but it did fall quite a bit for me against some of his other works. But the springtime vibes are pretty immaculate. I apologize that the lighting appears to be getting worse and worse, but a medieval classic that I would like to recommend is The Book of the City of Ladies by Christine de Pizan. So this is a medieval work that was written by a woman, and so you might can imagine that that's pretty rare in and of itself. This is an allegory where Christine de Pizan is building a city of ladies. And she talks a lot in this book about historical women, mythological women, women of faith, and pagan women. It's a very interesting text, especially if you want to look at kind of the formation of feminist thought across the medieval period. I think reading Christine de Pizan today can be quite revolutionary when you understand the context of the world in which she was living. But to the modern day, she also seems a little bit backwards, I think we would say, and her feminism is definitely medieval in origin. And so she's very interesting to read for a lot of different reasons. I think personally, on a personal level, she as the author is more interesting than this work. We chose this as our group read last year for Ancients-a-thon, and I thought it was really interesting to see the discussion that happened as people read this book. I personally like it for the spring because I really loved the imagery of the allegory of building this city. I had never read anything by Christine de Pizan before, and in fact, I would have to say I think she is probably the only female writer from the medieval period that I have read who was not a religious thinker or a mystic. And so this was interesting for a wide variety of reasons, and I think if you're looking for something to really dig into and get a lot out of in a philosophical sense, this book is definitely the way to go. I thought it was so fascinating. And what's really interesting are the women that she chooses to talk about in her own day and the women she chooses to ignore. So this is one I would go into with a little bit of background on Christine de Pizan, the author herself, because I think it's really going to enrich your experience. This was really enjoyable to me, not necessarily so much while I was reading it, as afterward thinking back on it. And I really think having it as a discussion piece, having it as a group read, was really wonderful because I felt like I got more out of it by discussing it with others. A classic of the Renaissance that I want to recommend is one of my favorite epic poems of all time. I think this is so dreamy and lush and wonderful to read, and that is The Liberation of Jerusalem by Torquato Tasso. So this is an Italian classic of the 1500s, and it is truly some of the most dreamy writing that you can read. This is about the First Crusade, and so in many ways it is a historical fiction piece. What I really appreciate about epic poetry in general is the attention to detail that characters seem to get in it. This was interesting to me for the verse. I thought the verse was really, really beautiful. And this Oxford edition to me felt like a very good translation. You know, sometimes you're reading something and you just feel like you're really getting the best of the best. That's definitely the way that I felt here. I felt like I was reading a really wonderful translation of this work. So of course the verse and how they translated it into a certain rhyme scheme is really the point of reading this, is really the reason that I would recommend it to you. But what I think was also really interesting was just how invested in the characters I got. Some of these people are real historical figures, and if you're familiar with the First Crusade, you're going to have a ball, because I did. But some of these people are fictional characters. I really, really enjoyed this, again, because it gave me a lot to think about, especially when you think we're about the same amount of time from Torquato Tasso as he was from the First Crusade. And so it's interesting to see how he interpreted events, and also how he changed them to craft the narrative that he wanted to craft in this overarching epic poem. So this was interesting for a lot of different reasons, but really the reason you should pick this up is if you like beautiful poetry and you like beautiful writing. This feels a bit like a forgotten classic to me because I had never heard very much about it. I feel like Orlando Furioso gets far more attention than this does, and that's one that is definitely on my list. It's one that I definitely want to read soon, but this is one I just don't understand why we aren't talking about more. It's really beautiful, it flies by, and it doesn't feel like you're reading dense poetry that you needed to take notes on. A perennial favorite of mine that I just think of as an iconic spring book is The Warden by Anthony Trollope. There is so much imagery in this book about a cathedral town. So there's imagery around the cathedral, but also in kind of the surrounding area that I think feels very cozy and very fresh in springtime. The Warden is the first in the Chronicles of Barsetshire, and it's very short. It's easily the shortest of the books in this series, and I've actually never carried on with this series, but I was really charmed by this. This is a very quiet story, and I'm just far more in the mood for something quiet here in the spring. This is a book that feels like it's set in the spring, but it also just feels like the type of story that I really enjoy reading at this time of year, very quiet, and also where the stakes feel relatively low. For a Victorian novel, this is relatively happy. I always intend to read more Anthony Trollope whenever I recommend this because I just thoroughly enjoyed this. And I think this probably has some pretty wide mass appeal. I think people can really like this if you just like Victorian classics, but if you are not familiar with classics at all, I think this is an easily digestible classic that you're not going to be confused by, especially in terms of language. The plot isn't dense, we aren't following too many characters. I think this is a really great place to start if you feel like you're uncomfortable with classics in general. Another poet of the ancient world that I would recommend reading this spring is Horace. He lived in the 1st century BC, and it seems like sometimes people don't think Horace is all that great nowadays, and a lot of that I really do think depends on the translator that you get. I tend to be very happy with the ancient works that I have read from the Oxford line. I really feel like their translators are absolutely incredible, and this is no exception. I really enjoy this edition. I'm currently rereading this, and a lot of these poems just kind of have the theme of spring and of new life. There's a lot of nature imagery, which I just think is ideal to read at this time of year. Because it is Horace, there's also a lot of war imagery. And so you can definitely pick and choose here which poems that you want to read and which ones that you really like. But I think for the most part, Horace in general really fits the spring. He's one of my favorite ancient poets. I really enjoy him, and I really enjoy Catullus. Catullus is probably another great one to recommend here, but I thought I would stick to one. And so Horace writes shorter poetry than Ovid. Metamorphoses is an epic poem, and these are short poems that you can read here and there, which I think makes them really ideal. Another thing Horace has going for him is that he was absolutely hilarious, and his jokes still translate well. So I would definitely recommend picking him up this spring. Can we get through a spring recommendations video that's all about classics without Middlemarch? Middlemarch is another classic that I feel like is just iconically spring. A lot of people read this in the spring, and a lot of people read it throughout the month of March, as a matter of fact. And so this is an ideal one if you're participating in March of the Mammoths. This is definitely a mammoth. I read this for Booktober in my first Booktober, and I really wished at the time that I had just waited on it, because it did feel so much more of a spring book than an autumn book. But I really, really enjoyed it. I think people are intimidated by this because of the length and because of George Eliot's writing style. And while it does take a little bit to get used to her writing style, I think this is actually a very easy to read and actually quite fun story. To me, it never felt this long, and I really enjoyed it. In fact, it's still probably one of my favorite George Eliot's. I have never really liked anything else from her besides Romola, but I thoroughly enjoyed this, and I read this when I was very new to classics in general, and specifically Victorian classics, but I found it immensely readable, and I really didn't want to put it down. This is in many ways quieter than other Victorian novels that were being published at the time. This feels more slice of life, and it feels more kind of country town drama to me than city life books like Charles Dickens is known for. There are definitely a lot of characters here, but they're all incredibly interesting. So this is one that I definitely recommend for this time of year. It feels very light, and it also feels like something you can very easily imagine and see. Middlemarch is often labeled one of the greatest books ever written. I don't know that I would give it that designation, but I do think it's really quite good, and it's not nearly as intimidating as you think it is. Another poet, this time from the medieval period, that I would recommend is Petrarch. I really like Petrarch. Petrarch is in many ways kind of a contemporary of Dante, though he came a little bit after when he was living. And Petrarch is credited with kind of founding the idea of the Dark Ages. He talks about how they're moving out of a dark age and moving into a new lighter age. And that theme definitely colors a lot of his work. He was a poet laureate. He had a muse named Laura, so a lot of these poems are incredibly romantic. I have always been fond of Petrarch. He just is not the lightning strike moment for me that Dante is, but he's not trying to do the same thing. And so I really enjoy these shorter poems from him, and I am hoping to complete this edition this spring. And so I want to go back through and tab. I want to try to read it in Italian because I got an edition that has the Italian on one side and the English on the other. I actually got this in Florence, and I often think of Florence in the spring. And I really don't know why, because I've never visited Italy in the spring. Petrarch is largely known today for being the creator of the sonnet as we know it. And so I really like sonnets, and I feel like sonnets feel like spring. So definitely something like Shakespeare's sonnets could go here, but I don't think people talk about Petrarch enough. So I really like Petrarch. I think he's ideal to read at this time of year, and I hope you really enjoy him. I would love to know down below if you have ever read him before, because I feel like I very rarely come across someone who has read a lot of him. But I really enjoy Petrarch. I really enjoy his imagery, and I really enjoy the meter that he writes in. Last but not least is another book that I recommend literally all the time, and it is First Love by Ivan Turgenev. Essentially, I would say read some short stories by Ivan Turgenev, because First Love isn't the only one I have read that I felt like was ideal for springtime. But First Love actually, I think, takes place between the cusp of spring and summer, and I just think as a love story, as kind of a coming of age story, that it really fits with the changing of the seasons. I read this for the first time a couple of years ago, actually on audiobook. And it's very rare that an audiobook connects with me the way that this one did. The ending of First Love is so insane. It's worth reading for the ending alone. But there are so many other really beautiful short stories that he wrote that I think are also really great to read in the spring. I kind of think in general that short stories feel like a springtime format for me. And I really don't know why, but I find that I tend to enjoy short stories at this time of year more than any other. But I would definitely recommend Ivan Turgenev's short stories, but specifically First Love. So that was a really quick video all about some classics that I would recommend you read this spring. I would love to know down below if you have read any of these, and I would love to know what classics you would recommend reading in the spring. But that's going to be all for me today. I hope you're all having a great week. Happy reading. Goodbye.